The first night I slept in Melvin's mansion, it wasn't the unfamiliar bed that kept me awake. It was the silence. Not a peaceful silence. This one felt observant, deliberate, as if the house was aware of me but undecided about accepting me. The ceiling above me stretched too high, too smooth, and I remember thinking that nothing in this room had been chosen with my comfort in mind. It had been designed to impress, not to hold someone gently. When I first walked through the doors that evening, I moved slowly, almost carefully, like the space required permission from my body. The marble floor was cold beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of polished stone and something expensive I couldn't name. Art lined the walls, pieces that looked important because they were meant to be. I didn't stop to study them. I already felt studied enough. Everything in that house seemed complete before I arrived, as if my presence was an afterthought folded into an already perfect equation. Melvin wasn't there long. He never was. A meeting ran late, a call came in, something urgent always pulling him away, just as I began to settle. By the time I finished unpacking my things into drawers that felt borrowed, he was already halfway out the door, adjusting his cufflinks, apologizing without slowing down. I stood in a dressing room larger than any place I'd ever lived and felt something unsteady in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, just the quiet realization that I was entering his world, not building one together. Later, hunger crept in softly. I found myself standing alone in the kitchen, opening a refrigerator that looked more like a display than a place for nourishment. Everything inside was arranged perfectly, untouched, waiting for someone with different habits than mine. I ate without sitting down. The sound of my movements echoed back at me, too loud, too noticeable, like the house was reminding me I was temporary. I felt surrounded by abundance and oddly invisible at the same time. When I finally returned to bed, I told myself this was what arrival was supposed to feel like. That comfort would follow. That meaning would arrive eventually, trailing behind wealth and security the way people promise it does. But as the lights dimmed on their own and the curtains closed without my touch, I felt it clearly for the first time. This wasn't a beginning. It was an introduction to a life where everything had space, except me. By morning, the mansion revealed itself more clearly, and somehow that made it worse. Sunlight poured in through walls of glass, generous and theatrical, illuminating rooms that felt staged rather than lived in. I walked from space to space barefoot, the echo of my steps following me like a reminder that Ag was alone inside something enormous. Every surface shone, every object was placed with intention, and yet there was nothing here that carried a trace of me, no abandoned cup, no wrinkled pillow, no sign that a human rhythm had ever been allowed to interrupt the perfection. I tried to find a place where I could sit and feel small on purpose, but the furniture resisted intimacy. Sofas were too wide, chairs too sculpted, tables too polished to rest my elbows on. Even the windows seemed to frame the world at a distance, turning mountains and sky into something decorative rather than reachable. I realized then that this house wasn't built to notice people. It was built to be admired, photographed, passed through. You didn't belong here. You appeared in it. Melvin's voice drifted through the space briefly, filtered through a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. His tone was calm, efficient, full of a certainty that didn't include me. He moved past without breaking stride, nodding in my direction the way someone acknowledges a familiar object. Not cold, just occupied. I watched him disappear down a hallway I still hadn't learned, and a quiet thought formed before I could stop it. This house knew him better than I ever would. I wandered into a room that looked like it was meant to be mine, a closet larger than my childhood bedroom, mirrors from every angle, shelves waiting for a version of me that felt more confident than the one standing there. I touched a dress hanging perfectly centered, tags still attached, and felt an odd resistance in my chest. The things provided for me were generous, but they didn't feel chosen. They felt assigned, like someone had solved for my presence without ever asking who I was. That afternoon, I sat by the pool alone, surrounded by stillness so controlled it felt artificial. The water didn't ripple unless I moved. The air didn't carry sound unless I made it. I thought about the places I'd lived before, smaller, louder, imperfect, and how they had noticed me immediately. How walls remembered laughter, how kitchens held conversations. Here, nothing responded. The mansion didn't reject me. It didn't welcome me either. It simply continued, flawless and indifferent, teaching me something I wasn't ready to admit yet. Space does not equal belonging. By the third day, I began to understand Malvin's schedule before I understood him. He moved through the house with the precision of someone who measured time and outcomes, not moments. Breakfast was a glass of something green he drank standing up. Conversations happened while he walked, never while he sat. When he spoke to me, it was usually in fragments, updates, reminders, questions that didn't require real answers. Did you sleep well? The driver will take you anywhere you want. We're hosting people on Friday. Each sentence landed politely, then vanished, leaving no room to respond with anything real. I noticed how carefully he avoided stillness with me. If I slowed down, he accelerated. If I lingered in a doorway, he passed through it. Once I tried to tell him about a dream I'd had. Something small, almost embarrassing, and he smiled absently while checking his phone, nodding at the wrong moments. I stopped halfway through the sentence, and he didn't notice. That was when it hit me. The silence between his words wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Silence was where questions lived, and Malvin didn't leave space for questions. At night, the house softened in ways it never did during the day. Lights dimmed automatically, curtains closed themselves. The quiet felt heavier then, more deliberate. I would hear Malvin's footsteps down the hall long after midnight, his presence announced by motion sensors rather than intention. Sometimes he paused at my door, not to enter, but as if checking that I was still where I belonged. The door never opened. The pause never lasted long. But it stayed with me, that brief acknowledgement without contact, like being counted instead of chosen. I started replaying earlier moments in my mind. How he had first invited me into this life. How his attention had once felt focused, almost curious. I wondered if I had changed, or if this was simply the part of him that emerged once everything else was secured. The thought unsettled me more than anger ever could, because if this distance wasn't cruelty, if it was just how he existed, then there was nothing to fight against, only something to endure. That night, lying alone in a bed too large to feel personal, I realized something quietly devastating. I wasn't lonely because Malvin was absent. I was lonely because he was present in a way that made absence feel intentional. The mansion hummed around me, alive with systems and safeguards, while I lay awake wondering how a person could be surrounded by so much and still feel so unacknowledged. And for the first time, a question formed that didn't fade with the dark. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for this house to notice? I began to notice how easy it was for the house to accommodate me without acknowledging me. Doors opened when I approached. Lights followed my movements. Staff anticipated my needs with quiet efficiency, yet never asked how I felt. It was as if my presence had been logged into the system, approved, authorized, invisible. I could spend an entire day moving from room to room without interrupting anything, without altering the rhythm of the place. The realization crept in slowly, and then all at once. I was not part of the life here. I was part of the infrastructure. Malvin's world functioned in layers I was never invited into. Calls stopped when I entered a room. Laptops angled away without apology. I learned to read the subtle cues, the tightening of his jaw when business followed him home, the way his voice softened for strangers and flattened for me. When I asked questions, he answered kindly but incompletely, like a teacher indulging a child's curiosity. I stopped asking soon after. Curiosity, I learned, was a form of trespassing. One afternoon, I found myself standing in a gallery hallway lined with photographs. Malvin with presidents, investors, men whose names carried weight in rooms I would never enter. There were no pictures of us. Not a single frame acknowledged that I existed beside him. I traced the edge of one photograph with my finger and felt something hollow open in my chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was erasure. I wasn't missing from his past because I didn't belong there. I was missing because I was never meant to be documented. That evening, I tried something small. I didn't wait for him to speak first. I told him I felt out of place here. Not angry, not accusing, just honest. He listened, really listened, his eyes steady on mine in a way I hadn't seen before. For a moment, hope stirred, fragile, dangerous. Then he smiled gently and said, "You'll get used to it." The sentence settled between us like a verdict. Not "I'll help you feel at home," not tell me more, just acceptance of my discomfort as inevitable. Later, alone again, I understood what that moment had taken from me. It wasn't reassurance I had been seeking, it was recognition. And by offering me adjustment instead of connection, Malvin confirmed what the house had already taught me. My discomfort wasn't a problem to solve. It was simply the cost of staying. As I lay awake that night, listening to the distant murmur of systems running flawlessly without me, I wondered when I had started shrinking to fit a space that was never designed to hold my voice. After that night, I began practicing a strange kind of restraint. Not because Malvin asked me to, and not because anyone enforced it, but because wanting less felt safer than wanting and being unanswered. I stopped waiting for him to come home early. I stopped dressing with the question of whether he would notice. I learned how to occupy space without expecting it to respond to me. In a house this large, it was easy to disappear deliberately. There was a comfort in routine when emotion became too unpredictable. I chose the same breakfast table every morning, the one closest to the window where the light arrived gently and left without ceremony. I walked the same paths through the mansion, memorized the timing of staff shifts, learned which rooms felt less hollow. It wasn't happiness, but it was stability. And stability, I told myself, was a kind of love grown practical with age. Malvin seemed calmer during this period. We argued less, spoke less, collided less. He would brush past me with a distracted smile, sometimes resting a hand briefly at my waist, as if checking that I was still there. Those moments confused me more than neglect ever had. They suggested intimacy without requiring it, presence without engagement. I began to wonder if this was what he had always wanted. A version of me that did not ask to be chosen, only accommodated. Occasionally, memories would surface uninvited. The way he once watched me talk, really watched, as if every word mattered. The nights we stayed up too late laughing at things that didn't need to make sense. Those recollections felt almost fictional now, like scenes from a life that had been edited out. I caught myself questioning whether I had imagined that closeness, or if it had simply expired without notice. One evening, I overheard him on the phone, his voice warm, animated, alive in a way I hadn't heard in months. I didn't recognize the name he said, but the tone pierced me all the same. Not because I suspected betrayal, but because it reminded me of what connection sounded like when it was effortless. I retreated quietly, ashamed of the ache it caused, ashamed that I still wanted something I had trained myself not to expect. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling and realized something unsettling. I had not been pushed out of his life. I had slowly stepped aside, not out of weakness, but out of adaptation. And the most dangerous part was how reasonable it felt. I wasn't fighting anymore, I was conserving. And somewhere in that discipline of wanting less, I feared I was losing the ability to recognize what I deserved to want at all. I used to think silence was neutral, something empty that waited to be filled. Living with Malvin taught me otherwise. Silence could be curated. It could be deliberate. It could be a language spoken fluently by someone who had learned that withholding was a form of control. By the time I understood this, the mansion had become too quiet to ignore. Even the house staff moved with a cautious restraint, as if they sensed the air had shifted and were afraid of disturbing something fragile and dangerous. There was no single moment when I realized I no longer recognized my own life. It happened gradually, the way you don't notice a room getting darker until you're squinting. Malvin still came home. He still asked if I'd eaten. He still nodded when I spoke. But his presence felt increasingly ceremonial, like a performance he maintained out of habit rather than desire. I began to feel like an artifact in his home, valuable, polished, and fundamentally untouched. At night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe, the soft hum of the security system, the distant rush of water through unseen pipes. Sometimes Malvin would be beside me, his back turned, his phone glowing faintly as he scrolled through something I was never meant to see. I stopped asking what held his attention, not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of the subtle irritation that crossed his face whenever my curiosity brushed against his boundaries. I started replaying memories I hadn't touched in years. In the early days, when the mansion was still unfamiliar, and I got lost in its corridors, when Malvin would laugh and guide me by the hand, teasing me gently as if my disorientation amused him. I remembered thinking then that the house was too large for two people, that we would eventually grow into it. Now I understood the cruel irony. The house had grown into him, and I had been left behind. There was a morning, quiet, ordinary, that changed something inside me. I stood in the master bathroom, surrounded by marble and gold fixtures, staring at my reflection. I looked composed, expensive, untouched by struggle. And yet, beneath the surface, I felt hollowed out, like a room stripped of furniture but still expected to host guests. I pressed my palm against the mirror and felt an unexpected surge of anger. Not at Malvin, at myself, for adapting so well to being absent from my own life. That day, I did something small but radical. I didn't wait for Malvin's schedule. I didn't ask permission or seek acknowledgement. I left the house alone and walked the estate grounds without a destination. The path wound through manicured gardens and quiet overlooks where the city shimmered in the distance. I realized I had spent years admiring this view without ever feeling part of it. The world had always been something Malvin owned, and I was merely allowed to observe. When I returned, Malvin barely noticed. He glanced up briefly, nodded once, and went back to his call. That was the moment the truth settled heavily in my chest. My presence was optional, not disruptive, not comforting, simply optional, and something in me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I began to pay attention to the patterns in his absences, to the way his tone shifted when certain names appeared on his screen, to how carefully he kept parts of his life sealed away, even within his own home. The power dynamic between us was no longer hidden. It was laid bare in every unasked question and every unanswered glance. For the first time since moving into the mansion, I stopped trying to belong. And in that letting go, I felt something unfamiliar begin to rise. Not freedom yet, but awareness, the kind that hurts before it heals. Awareness is a dangerous thing when it arrives before you are ready to act on it. Once I saw the shape of my life clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction with Malvin became sharper, edged with meaning I had previously softened for my own comfort. I noticed how he spoke around me rather than to me, how conversations ended before they truly began. Even his kindness, when it appeared, felt procedural, like a task he completed to reassure himself that he hadn't completely failed at being present. I began keeping my thoughts to myself, not out of fear, but out of quiet observation. There was power in watching without reacting. I studied the rhythm of his days, the predictability of his routines, the way he controlled every variable except the one standing in front of him. It struck me then that Malvin wasn't cruel. He was efficient. And efficiency leaves no room for emotional mess, no tolerance for needs that cannot be scheduled or optimized. One evening, as we sat across from each other at a dining table long enough to seat 12, I realized we had not truly looked at one another in weeks. The candlelight reflected off polished silverware, casting soft shadows across his face, but his eyes were elsewhere, fixed on a future I wasn't invited into. I wondered if he noticed how small I felt in that moment, how my voice had learned to shrink itself to fit the gaps he left behind. A memory surfaced without warning. A simpler time, a rented apartment before the mansion, before the staff, before the carefully curated distance. I remembered Malvin leaning against a kitchen counter, sleeves rolled up, asking my opinion about nothing important at all. The memory hurt more than any recent neglect, because it proved that what I missed had once been real, and that meant it had been consciously abandoned. That night, I asked him a question I had avoided for a long time, not a confrontation, just a soft inquiry. I asked if he was happy. The pause that followed was long enough to feel intentional. He looked at me then, really looked, as if assessing the cost of honesty. When he finally answered, his words were vague, polished, safe. He spoke about work, about pressure, about responsibility. He did not speak about us. Something shifted inside me then, not with anger, but with clarity. I understood that my loneliness was not an accident. It was a byproduct of the life he had chosen to prioritize, and I had been accommodating it under the illusion that patience was the same as love. The realization didn't make me cry. It made me still. In the days that followed, I started imagining my life without the mansion, without the silence, without the constant negotiation of my own importance. The thought scared me, but it also brought an unfamiliar sense of calm. For the first time, the future didn't revolve around waiting for Malvin to notice me. It revolved around whether I was willing to notice myself. By the end of that week, I knew something had to change. Not dramatically, not explosively, but decisively. The power between us had always leaned in his favor, supported by wealth, influence, and control. But power shifts quietly sometimes, when one person stops asking to be chosen. I didn't tell Malvin what I was thinking. I didn't announce my awakening. I simply began preparing, internally, for a version of myself that no longer measured her worth by proximity to his life. And once that seed was planted, there was no returning to who I had been before. The decision didn't arrive with fireworks or declarations. It came quietly, the way truth often does when it has waited long enough to be acknowledged. I woke up one morning and realized I was no longer trying to be seen. That was how I knew something fundamental had shifted. The mansion felt the same, vast, immaculate, indifferent, but I moved through it differently, as if I were already halfway gone. The silence no longer felt like rejection, it felt like confirmation. Malvin noticed, of course, not immediately and not in the way I once wished he would. He noticed in fragments, in the way I no longer lingered near his office door, in the way I answered his questions without adding anything extra, without trying to extend the conversation. He noticed that I had stopped waiting for him to arrive before beginning my evenings. What he didn't notice was how much strength it took to detach without becoming bitter. One afternoon, we crossed paths in the hallway outside the glass atrium. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor, turning everything bright and unreal. He asked where I had been going so often lately. The question sounded casual, but there was something unsettled beneath it. I told him the truth, that I'd been taking long walks, spending time thinking. He nodded, as if this explanation fit neatly into a mental box he could label and ignore. But his eyes lingered on me a second too long, searching for something he couldn't name. That night, I packed a small bag. Not because I was leaving immediately, but because I needed to know that I could. I folded my clothes carefully, choosing only what felt like mine, items that carried memory, texture, intention. The act itself felt ceremonial, as if I were honoring a version of myself that had survived quietly for too long. When I zipped the bag shut, my hands were steady. That surprised me. Malvin found me sitting at the edge of the bed later, the bag beside me like an unanswered question. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply asked what was happening. For a moment, I considered giving him the speech I had rehearsed in my head, the one filled with careful language and softened truths. But standing there, looking at a man who had shared my space, but not my life, I understood that explanations were no longer my responsibility. I told him I had lived in his world for a long time without ever truly belonging to it. I told him that loving someone shouldn't feel like constantly editing yourself to remain acceptable. My voice didn't shake. His did. He spoke then, finally, about fear, about the weight of expectations, about how he had learned to protect everything except the people closest to him. He said my name like it carried regret, but regret, I had learned, is not the same as change. I didn't leave that night, not because I doubted myself, but because closure doesn't always require distance. Sometimes it requires presence, one last moment of clarity. We sat in that room, two people bound by history and undone by neglect, and for the first time, there was no illusion to maintain. What we had was real, and what we lacked was undeniable. When I eventually walked out of the mansion, the air outside felt lighter than I expected. The world didn't collapse. No alarms sounded. I realized then how much of my fear had been internal, built from years of believing that security was the same as fulfillment. As I stepped away, I wasn't walking toward certainty. I was walking toward myself. I don't know what Malvin tells people now. I don't know how he explains my absence in rooms I once quietly occupied. What I do know is this. I lived in a billion-dollar mansion surrounded by everything money could provide and still felt invisible. Leaving didn't make me brave overnight, but it made me honest, and that honesty became the foundation of a life where I no longer disappear inside someone else's success.